No headlines, no palace statements, just a whisper that slipped through gilded corridors. Princess Anne and Princess Beatrice had joined forces. It began not with confrontation, but with silence, the kind of silence that echoes louder than any decree. Behind the polished smiles of royal duty, something deeper stirred an unease about the direction of the crown itself. To the world, all seemed steady. Ceremonies gleamed, the monarchy's rhythm unbroken. But beneath that façade, two women bound by blood and bound by fear were drawing an invisible line against Queen Camilla's growing shadow. Anne, the embodiment of stoic loyalty, had spent her life defending tradition. She had watched empires of influence rise and fall within the palace walls, yet never before had she felt the old order so vulnerable. It wasn't Charles she distrusted, it was the quiet network that had begun to surround him. Camilla's family, once peripheral, now seemed poised to inherit the privileges once reserved for those born royal. The subtle placements at key events, the murmured discussions about peerages, the strategic introductions, it all felt deliberate. Anne, who had survived decades of royal storms, recognized the pattern of power consolidation. Meanwhile, Beatrice had long remained in the soft periphery of the monarchy, polite, kind, unassuming, until the whispers reached her. Her daughter, still innocent to the complexities of royal bloodlines, represented the next generation. But in that generation's future, Beatrice began to see the outlines of exclusion. Camilla's bloodline, once an outsider's branch, was slowly weaving itself into the tree's center. The prospect was not just unsettling, it was existential. For Beatrice, this wasn't about pride. It was about protection of heritage, of her mother's fading dignity, and of her child's unspoken claim to the legacy of Windsor. Their paths crossed one crisp evening at a private Windsor retreat. Officially, it was a family weekend, a chance for quiet reflection. Unofficially, it became the birthplace of an alliance that would shake the foundations of the monarchy. In that secluded estate, away from prying eyes and the Queen's advisors, Anne spoke first. Her words were deliberate, weighty. "It's not about the throne," she murmured. "It's about what's left when the throne changes." Beatrice listened, the conflict evident in her eyes. By the time the fire burned low, hesitation had given way to resolve. In that moment, something unspoken passed between them, a recognition that neither could stand alone. They understood the cost of intervention. To move against the Queen Consort's influence was to challenge not just a woman, but an entire narrative of modern monarchy. Yet both knew inaction would mean surrendering the very essence of royal legitimacy to outsiders who had not carried the burden of the crown's expectations. The pact was not written, not spoken aloud. It was sealed in silence, forged in looks and trust. They would move quietly, never confronting openly, but always steering through influence, through history, through the very laws that defined what it meant to be royal. The operation had no name, no agenda, and no trace. But it had a purpose. And that purpose, once ignited, would not fade. Anne returned to her duties with renewed precision, her every public word calculated. Beatrice, on the other hand, retreated behind her soft public image, smiling, gracious, yet observant. Together, they became ghosts within their own family, orchestrating something larger than either could fully control. They understood the risk. Discovery would mean exile from influence, perhaps even from the heart of the royal machine itself. But preservation demanded sacrifice. What they didn't realize then was that silence, once weaponized, can never remain contained. The air inside the palace grows thin with secrets, and even the quietest alliances create ripples. Those ripples, carried through courtiers and confidantes, soon reached ears that were never meant to hear. But every pact, no matter how quiet, leaves echoes, and those echoes were already beginning to stir. To the world, Camilla was the picture of restraint, the dutiful queen consort, who had endured decades of scandal, gossip, and public judgment, only to emerge serene and untouchable. Her smile was soft, her gestures measured, her words always deferential. But within the walls of the palace, far from flashing cameras and royal photographers, another portrait was quietly being painted, one of ambition, precision, and legacy. Camilla had never been one to seek applause, but power, she understood. And now, she wanted to wield it not for herself, but for her bloodline. It began subtly. Tom Parker Bowles, once known only as a respected food critic, began appearing more frequently at private royal gatherings. No official titles, no formal announcements, just presence, the kind that turns familiarity into influence. Laura Lopes, Camilla's daughter, followed suit. Her quiet confidence, her calm mannerisms, her strategic charm, all the things that once made her invisible, were now what made her indispensable. They were no longer guests at royal events. They were part of them. Camilla had opened a door, and her family was stepping through it. Behind closed doors, quiet conversations began taking shape. Small remarks during dinners, polite suggestions in corridors, all with one intention: to secure her family's place within the royal structure. Her strategy wasn't brute force, it was patience wrapped in grace. Titles, honors, patronages, the whispers of future roles, all dressed as gestures of gratitude, loyalty, and service. But make no mistake, these weren't gestures. They were investments in permanence. King Charles, tired from years of balancing family fractures and public expectations, began to yield. It was easier that way. After all, hadn't Camilla stood by him through decades of adversity? He saw no threat in her ambitions, only a woman reclaiming respect. And perhaps, in his eyes, she deserved that. But what he saw as harmless, others saw as dangerous. For every privilege granted to Camilla's kin, an older branch of the royal tree felt its roots loosening. Inside the Queen's private council, debate stirred. Advisors whispered of precedents, of tradition, of the invisible hierarchy that had governed the monarchy for centuries. Could Camilla's lineage, outsiders by every definition, be legitimized without consequence? Some argued yes, citing modernity and equality. Others, the old crown guards, recoiled. Among them stood Anne, unwavering, unsmiling, and unwilling to let sentiment rewrite sovereignty. She had weathered every scandal, every shift in public favor. But this felt different. It wasn't just a breach of etiquette, it was a threat to continuity. Princess Beatrice watched it unfold from a quieter corner of royal life. She wasn't in the inner circle, but she didn't need to be. She saw patterns others ignored. Every new title given, every appearance sanctioned, tipped the balance a little further away from her generation. The future she once assumed was hers, one tied by blood and birthright, was slowly slipping into the hands of those who had never carried the crown's weight. She felt the sting of inevitability creeping in, the quiet realization that in the monarchy, influence was not inherited, it was constructed. Camilla's ambition, cloaked in elegance, had become an undercurrent running beneath every royal function and formal event. It was invisible but undeniable, whispered but powerful. It was not about greed or rebellion, it was about survival through legacy. Her family had once lived in the shadows of scandal, now she would see them stand in the light of legitimacy. But what she didn't foresee was that her quest for permanence would awaken old loyalties long thought dormant. And so, what began as silent discomfort soon turned into a quiet campaign of resistance, one fueled not by envy, but by survival. For Princess Anne, duty was not a slogan, it was oxygen. She had breathed it since childhood, carried it like a torch through decades of chaos, scandal, and shifting loyalties. Yet now, that same duty demanded something unthinkable: to stand against her own brother. The crown, to Anne, was no prize of inheritance. It was an unbroken chain, sacred, fragile, and never to be compromised by convenience or affection. But as she watched Charles bend, ever so gently, to Camilla's persuasion, something deep within her began to fracture. The monarchy she had spent her life defending was being reshaped, quietly and irreversibly, before her eyes. Anne had always been the steel spine of the royal family, the one who neither faltered nor flattered. Where others smiled for cameras, she stood firm in silence. But this time, silence was not my strength. It was surrender. She began to notice things that others dismissed. The new influence of Camilla's circle, the subtle shift of priorities within Charles's household, and the steady emergence of names that had never belonged to the Windsor line. The crown was being softened, reshaped, and slowly redirected not by decree, but by quiet suggestion. In the solitude of her private study, Anne wrote to her brother. The letters were careful, measured, and painfully honest. She warned him that the crown could not be divided between personal loyalty and national duty, that once sentiment entered the equation, the institution would no longer lead it. But her letters went unanswered, not out of neglect, but avoidance. Charles, weary from a lifetime of conflict and seeking peace at any cost, could not bear another confrontation with his sister. He saw her as rigid, unyielding, a remnant of a past that no longer fit the world he wished to lead. When words failed, Anne turned to action. Late at night, under the quiet hum of palace corridors, she began meeting privately with Lord Chamberlain, one of the last men in the monarchy still bound to its original code of duty. Their conversations were brief but urgent. Whispers of new peerages, ceremonial honours, and official recognition for Camilla's family had begun circulating within the Privy Council. To the public, these gestures would appear harmless, a queen honouring those closest to her. But to Anne, they signalled something catastrophic, the merging of royal blood with a family that had never carried the burden of royal expectation. The night she saw the document, a confidential draft outlining proposed peerages for Camilla's relatives, was the night Anne's patience died. She stood for a long time in silence, staring at the paper as if it were a wound to the very soul of the monarchy. The idea that centuries of lineage could be diluted by affection felt to her like betrayal, not just of tradition, but of history itself. And yet, as the weight of the moment pressed on her, Anne realized that resistance would mean turning against her brother, the man she had once sworn to protect. Her turmoil was profound. The conflict between family and duty tore through her like a storm. To act was to betray love. To remain silent was to betray legacy. She knew Charles was not acting out of greed or malice. He was a man trying to heal the wounds of his past, to right the wrongs that love had once denied him. But the monarchy was not built to heal. It was built to endure, and endurance often demanded cruelty disguised as discipline. So, with her heart heavy and her conscience unsteady, Anne made her choice. She would resist quietly, strategically, but completely. There would be no public defiance, no outburst, no rebellion. Her weapon would be influence, not outrage. The steel of her will would have to be sharper than ever before. For the first time in her life, duty and love no longer walked side by side. They stood on opposite ends of a battlefield. As she sealed away the last of her correspondence that night, Anne felt the loneliness of her decision settle in. She had chosen the crown over blood, and she knew there would be no forgiveness for it. Not from Charles, not from Camilla, perhaps not even from herself. Yet she believed that one day, history would be understood. But resistance requires allies, and Anne's unexpected partner would shock even her most loyal aides. Behind her soft demeanour and polished grace, Princess Beatrice held a weapon no one expected access to. She was the modern royal, well-liked, inoffensive, and unthreatening. That was her strength. While others underestimated her, she moved quietly between world's royal circles, elite gatherings, discreet dinners in London's most private clubs, collecting fragments of conversation that few noticed and even fewer understood. These weren't idle whispers. They were pieces of a much larger puzzle, one she had been unconsciously assembling for years. When Princess Anne knocked, Beatrice didn't hesitate. She was ready to use everything she had, every favour, every secret, every carefully guarded confidence for one purpose only, to protect the lineage that defined her very name. Beatrice's disillusionment had been slow but steady. She had grown up watching the crown's influence fade in the eyes of the public, but never had she imagined that the true erosion would come from within. The people were rewriting not the monarchy's traditions once untouchable, but by Camilla's growing circle of quiet influence. What began as whispered invitations and private recognitions was fast becoming a shift in hierarchy. Camilla's family, once outsiders, tolerated at best, were now being positioned as legitimate extensions of the royal line. To Beatrice, it wasn't modernization, it was infiltration. Her mother, Sarah Ferguson, had seen it coming long before her daughter had. Power never announces itself, she had warned in one of their late-night conversations. It smiles, it thanks you, and then it replaces you. Beatrice hadn't understood at first. She had brushed it off as bitterness from a woman who had lived through the monarchy's coldest rejection. But now, she could see the same creeping shadow that her mother had once fought against, now wearing a crown. Every new headline about Camilla's relatives being honoured, every mention of their presence at private functions, cut deeper than the last. Unlike Anne, Beatrice had no authority within the institution. What she had instead was proximity to politicians, financiers, aristocrats, and social power brokers, who still operated in the grey zone between tradition and ambition. She was the kind of royal who could blend into high society gatherings and hear things no one would dare say inside Buckingham's walls. Over time, she began to collect information, offhand remarks about pending honours, discussions about hereditary considerations, and one particularly troubling whisper about a formal petition for titles. It was enough to alarm her. But what turned her unease into action was a document she came across by accident, correspondence between a senior courtier and a private secretary, referencing the possibility of permanent recognition for Camilla's kin. When Anne reached out, Beatrice didn't need convincing. The two met discreetly, often under the guise of family visits or charity discussions. Their communication became a careful dance-coded messages within personal letters, brief exchanges at public events, where smiles concealed strategy. The age gap between them vanished under the weight of shared purpose. Anne brought the steel of experience, Beatrice, the reach of youth. Together, they formed a bridge between the monarchy's unyielding past and its uncertain future. It was Beatrice who provided the most crucial piece of evidence of how Camilla's allies were quietly lobbying to formalize positions for her children. It wasn't an open coup, but it was close enough. The revelation confirmed Anne's worst fears. What had been speculation was now a strategy. They had to act not tomorrow, not next month, but before the next parliamentary session, where subtle policy shifts could cement these changes permanently. What followed was not rebellion, but precision. They would not confront Camilla that would draw attention and sympathy. Instead, they would use the very thing Camilla sought to manipulate, the monarchy's own traditions. The system had always moved slowly, buried in formality and ritual. Now, that very slowness would become their weapon. Anne would work within the institution, reminding senior courtiers of precedence and hierarchy. Beatrice would operate externally, planting quiet doubts among political and aristocratic circles. They didn't need to destroy Camilla's ambitions. They only needed to delay them, to bury them under the crushing weight of royal tradition, where time itself becomes resistance. Every move they made would be deliberate, silent, and impossible to trace. For the first time in decades, two generations of women, one forged by duty, the other by adaptability, were united by the same fear, that the monarchy's bloodline was slipping through their fingers. Together, they devised a plan not to confront but to corner Camilla's ambitions under the weight of royal tradition itself. The beauty of royal warfare is its invisibility. No shouting, no blood, just paper, protocol, and precedent. That was the battlefield Anne and Beatrice chose. They understood that within the monarchy, power rarely came from open defiance. It came from patience, timing, and the subtle manipulation of history itself. So, rather than challenging Camilla's growing influence outright, they decided to bury it quietly, methodically beneath the unyielding weight of royal tradition. It began with the archives. Anne, with her unmatched knowledge of the monarchy's inner workings, instructed trusted aides to unearth long-forgotten precedents, moments when similar attempts at elevating non-royal families had ended in disgrace. Each record was a weapon, each outdated statute a shield. The goal wasn't confrontation, it was obstruction disguised as preservation. Every move had to look like loyalty, Every delay had to feel like duty. The old laws, once forgotten, were now their allies, and the dusty echoes of the past became their most potent form of defense. Beatrice played her part flawlessly. Where Anne wielded authority, Beatrice wielded charm. She whispered reminders of historical caution to sympathetic courtiers during luncheons and diplomatic events. What she framed as concern for optics was, in truth, a carefully planted seed of resistance. Slowly, conversations within the palace began to shift. Camilla's proposals for new titles and hereditary privileges started facing polite but persistent questions. Would this set a dangerous precedent? Might the public interpret it poorly? The same voices that once nodded in approval began to hesitate. But hesitation alone wasn't enough. So, Anne and Beatrice expanded their influence beyond palace walls. Through intermediaries, they began leaking selective information to sympathetic journalists, not accusations, but suggestions. Subtle pieces about unofficial discussions over the potential elevation of Camilla's relatives. The articles didn't attack anyone. They simply posed questions about tradition and the sanctity of royal bloodlines. Within days, the effect was visible. Public opinion stirred uneasily. The monarchy thrived on stability, and the mere idea of change, especially one that blurred royal purity, unsettled even the most devoted loyalists. Meanwhile, Anne began working her contacts within Parliament. It wasn't the ministers or party leaders she approached, but the quiet traditionalists, the lifers, defenders of the old order. Over private correspondence and discreet encounters, she reminded them that every monarchy in history had been weakened not by outsiders, but by its own willingness to adapt too far. For them, it wasn't about Camilla, it was about the principle. And principle, when threatened, is a rallying cry no politician can ignore. Together, Anne and Beatrice created a slow-moving storm. Nothing they did appeared aggressive. Every letter, every suggestion, every leak was cloaked in the language of caution. Even their gestures carried meaning. Anne's renewed focus on historical ceremonies. Beatrice's public speeches emphasizing heritage and continuity. Each moment subtly redirected attention away from modern reforms and back toward the sanctity of royal lineage. The message was clear, without ever being spoken. The monarchy must remain pure, untampered, and untouched. Weeks turned into months, and then came the shift. Camilla's carefully structured proposals, the peerages, the titles, the quiet recognition for her family began to slow. First, they were under review. Then, awaiting further discussion. And finally, the quiet words that Anne had been waiting for, delayed indefinitely. To the outside world, it seemed procedural. Inside the palace, it was a quiet victory. The machinery of progress had been jammed by the invisible gears of history. But victory in the monarchy is never final. Even as Anne and Beatrice exhaled in private satisfaction, subtle ripples began to form on the other side. Camilla's circle had noticed the resistance, the delays, the whispers, the sudden coolness from those who had once been supportive. And for a woman who had clawed her way through decades of scrutiny, silence was never a threat she ignored. But the crown was never blind for long, and soon, Camilla's camp began to fight back. When whispers become movements, the palace listens. And this time the whispers had become a silent rebellion. What had started as private resistance in the shadows of Windsor had reached the gilded walls of Clarence House, and Queen Camilla was listening. Her circle, a tight network of seasoned courtiers and loyal advisors, began to trace the roots of the obstruction. It didn't take long to find the trail leading straight to Anne and Beatrice, but Camilla was no stranger to conflict. She had survived decades of public scorn, betrayal, and humiliation. She didn't fight with fury, she fought with finesse. What followed was not confrontation, but calculation of the kind of royal retaliation that comes hidden behind smiles, handshakes, and public grace. It began subtly, as it always does in royal warfare. Invitations to key events that once included Beatrice began to dry up. Her name disappeared quietly from guest lists, her appearances at state banquets postponed for scheduling reasons. In high society circles, whispers about her loyalty began to circulate, too well-timed, too specific to be coincidence. Rumors hinted that Beatrice had grown disenchanted with the monarchy, that she was too close to outside influences, that her priorities were personal, not patriotic. These weren't accidents. They were precision strikes designed to isolate her without ever exposing the hand that dealt the blow. Camilla's aides knew exactly how to dismantle opposition, not through accusation, but reputation, and Beatrice, with her soft-spoken manner and trusting nature, became the easiest target. Stories began surfacing in gossip columns, light at first, then sharper, crueler, a rift among the younger royals. Tensions brewing behind palace doors. Then, one morning, the headlines turned personal. Beatrice's fiancé was suddenly the subject of financial irregularities, his business dealings questioned without foundation. The story spread like wildfire, splashed across tabloids with insinuations carefully framed to damage without proof. It was retaliation masquerading as coincidence, and everyone inside the palace knew it. Anne, however, remained untouchable, at least publicly. Her reputation as the monarchy's unwavering pillar could not easily be fractured. But Camilla's camp understood that even the strongest armor has cracks. A series of anonymous sources began leaking stories, painting Anne as bitter, controlling, even jealous. Tabloid editorials described her as unable to adapt to the modern monarchy, a relic of an era long past. Others suggested she resented her brother's happiness, that she could not forgive Camilla for what history had denied her own mother. It was a portrait drawn in quiet cruelty, and though Anne never dignified it with a response, she felt each blow with silent fury. Charles found himself between two worlds, his wife and his sister. To one, he owed love, to the other, loyalty. The more he tried to mediate, the worse it became. Camilla's confidence grew with every public appearance, every subtle victory. Anne's resolve hardened behind her calm exterior, and Beatrice, caught between generations, became the collateral damage of a war she had helped ignite but could no longer control. Inside palace walls, tensions simmered beneath the surface of civility. Meetings were colder, glances sharper, and even the smallest gestures were charged with meaning. The crown demanded unity, but the cracks were widening. Camilla's camp had made their move swift, strategic, devastatingly precise. Yet the monarchy is an old creature, and history has shown that it never allows deceit to remain hidden for long. Because in the palace, truth is never buried, only delayed, and this time it would surface not in whispers or tabloids, but in the most public setting of all. What was meant to be a state banquet became a stage for betrayal. Beneath the glitter of crystal chandeliers and the delicate hum of diplomatic conversation, a storm was waiting to break. The evening had been planned to celebrate unity, a display of elegance and order before foreign dignitaries and loyal peers. Yet, beneath the surface, the air was thick with tension. Months of quiet warfare between Anne, Beatrice, and Camilla had pushed the royal family to its breaking point. Every glance, every pause in conversation carried unspoken weight, and then, in one sentence, that fragile illusion of peace collapsed. When Charles rose for his toast, the room stilled. His speech began as expected, gracious, measured, full of praise for service and duty. But then, in what seemed like a harmless flourish, he raised his glass and thanked those who have stood by us not only in the House of Windsor, but among our extended family. The words seemed innocuous to most, but to Anne, they landed like a strike. Extended family. It was deliberately a quiet recognition of Camilla's bloodline, a signal of inclusion where there should have been restraint. For Camilla, it was vindication. For Anne and Beatrice, war was declared in public. Beatrice froze, her polite smile faltering just long enough for the cameras to catch it. Across the table, Anne's expression never changed, but her stillness spoke louder than any reaction. The photographers caught what they thought was a passing moment, an incidental glance between aunt and niece. They had no idea they'd captured the fracture of a family. As the evening continued, the tension thickened. Every exchange between Anne and Camilla dripped with civility and concealed venom. Polite laughter masked barbed words. When dessert arrived, Camilla leaned toward Anne with a thin smile and murmured something too quiet to hear something that made Anne's fork clatter softly against her plate. Those near enough to notice pretended not to. Within minutes, the Queen's personal secretary excused himself from the table, his expression from a silent code known only within royal circles. It meant one thing: crisis. By dawn, the illusion of unity was gone. The press, ever hungry for cracks in the royal façade, had already seized the moment. Tabloids splashed with headlines, "Royal rift explodes at banquet," and "Tension between Anne and Camilla boils over." Photographs of Beatrice's frozen expression became symbols of rebellion, analysed and exaggerated across morning broadcasts. Public opinion, once indifferent to internal politics, began to turn restless. The idea of discord within the crown was dangerous. It threatened the very foundation of its power, perception. Charles, caught between love and duty, tried to contain the fallout. But his attempts to downplay the incident only deepened the divide. Camilla viewed the banquet as proof that Anne and Beatrice were undermining her publicly. Anne saw it as confirmation that the Queen Consort's influence had gone too far. Beatrice, humiliated by the attention and cornered by the press, felt the walls closing in. What had once been a discreet alliance had now been exposed, leaving both women vulnerable and furious. But humiliation, in the royal world, does not breed retreat. It breeds retaliation. Anne and Beatrice had been pushed into a corner, and now there was no turning back. The quiet alliance that began in whispers was about to become something far more calculated, far more dangerous. Their next move would not be about resistance, it would be about control. Because in the monarchy, every betrayal demands an answer, and this time, the alliance's final act would decide who truly shaped the future of the crown. In the quiet of Buckingham's archive rooms, beneath centuries of dust and legacy, Princess Anne signed a document few would ever see. It wasn't a royal decree, nor a public announcement. It was something far more dangerous. A proposal veiled in tradition, cloaked in duty, and sharpened with intent. The paper carried a name as old as monarchy itself, the Charter of Lineage. To anyone who might stumble upon it, it would appear harmless, a reaffirmation of the crown's ancient commitment to bloodline continuity. But beneath its graceful language lay a calculated truth. This was not preservation. It was an exclusion, and its target was unmistakable: Camilla's family. Anne had worked with surgical precision, enlisting the help of a handful of trusted legal historians, men whose loyalty had been tested by time and circumstance. They knew the monarchy's archives like a priest knows his scripture, every clause, every forgotten precedent. Together, they reconstructed a doctrine of legitimacy, one that emphasized direct blood descent from the sovereign line as the sole path to hereditary recognition. In other words, it drew a line cold, permanent, and irrefutable around who could and could not claim the privileges of royal association. It was Anne's quiet rebellion turned to policy, her final stand written not in words of defiance, but in the elegant calligraphy of tradition. Beatrice became the courier of the cause. While Anne crafted the doctrine, Beatrice maneuvered it through the palace's political veins, ensuring the charter reached the Privy Council without scrutiny. She knew which doors to knock on, which conversations to initiate, and, more importantly, which to avoid. Through discreet intermediaries, the proposal was framed not as confrontation, but as preservation, a noble gesture to safeguard heritage and maintain public trust. It was a masterpiece of manipulation, a strike disguised as stewardship, and when it reached the council, it bore the weight of inevitability. Camilla realized too late what was happening. When whispers of the charter reached her, the machinery had already been set in motion. She understood instantly that this was no mere administrative document. It was a fortress built against her family. The language of the charter made it impossible for anyone without royal blood to hold hereditary titles or ceremonial precedents connected to the crown. The same principles that had once been her shield: tradition, protocol, the preservation of legacy, were now being weaponized against her. She had spent years shaping the monarchy's modern face, and now that same institution had turned its back, sealing the gates she had tried so carefully to open. Charles was furious not because he disagreed with his sister, but because he couldn't stop her. The optics were delicate. Publicly opposing a measure that emphasized lineal integrity would paint him as weak, even treacherous to his own heritage. The monarchy's stability depended on unity, and so, reluctantly, he yielded. His endorsement came with heavy words about continuity and responsibility, but to those who knew the truth, his silence spoke louder than his speech. It was the ultimate irony, a king forced to honor the very tradition that undermined his wife's ambitions. When the charter was quietly ratified, no announcements were made. There was no press release, no fanfare, no royal signature displayed on velvet cloth. It existed only in confidential files, a ghost policy sealed in the crown's inner vaults. Yet its effects were immediate and irreversible. Invitations ceased. Discussions of titles faded into silence. The Queen Consort's relatives, once on the cusp of integration, found themselves politely but permanently edged out of every conversation that mattered. Anne and Beatrice never celebrated their victory. There were no smiles, no congratulations, only quiet acknowledgement. They had done what needed to be done. But victory in the monarchy is never clean. The crown remembers, and so do those. It wounds. Behind the marble walls and polite smiles, new alliances began to stir. Because in the corridors they fought to protect, whispers never truly die. They simply wait for the next opportunity to rise. Today, the public sees harmony photographs of unity, smiles on balconies, gestures of reconciliation that seem to erase every shadow of division. Yet within the crown's heart lies the residue of a war fought in silence. The alliance between Anne and Beatrice may have saved tradition, but it did so at a cost too great to ever name aloud. The monarchy survived intact, its image untarnished before the world. But behind the glittering façade, the quiet battle for bloodline and power had left scars that no public performance could heal. The victory Anne and Beatrice secured was never celebrated, for how could it be? Their triumph was built on secrecy and sacrifice. The Charter of Lineage had sealed their intent, restoring the purity of royal succession, but it also fractured what little peace remained within the family. Relationships that once relied on unspoken trust had turned brittle. Conversations became cautious, eyes watchful, and even silence felt dangerous. Camilla smiled for the cameras, gracious as ever, but those close enough could see the chill in her eyes, the composure too practiced to be real. Her family, once poised for elevation, now lingered on the edge of royal life, their invitations fewer, their names absent from mention. She had lost a battle she hadn't even known was being waged until it was already over. Anne, the architect of the quiet rebellion, withdrew even further into the discipline of duty. The world saw her as steady, dependable, unshaken, the unmovable force within the royal firmament. But behind that iron composure was a woman worn by the consequences of her own resolve. She had protected the monarchy from dilution, yet in doing so, she had distanced herself from those she loved most. Her bond with Charles, once grounded in mutual respect, now rested on a polite, almost ceremonial civility. There was no open hostility, just a hollow space where affection lived. She understood the cost. To preserve the crown, she had surrendered her brother. Beatrice, meanwhile, became the silent guardian of what they had fought for. Her role within the family seemed unchanged, but beneath the surface, her influence had grown quietly formidable. She understood the new rules, the power hidden in subtle gestures, the strength in restraint. Her mother's worldliness, Anne's steel, and her own intuition merged into something rare. A younger royal who understood the value of invisibility. She knew that her alliance with Anne could never be spoken of, yet it shaped every decision she made thereafter. Beatrice became the quiet custodian of continuity, ensuring that what had been protected through subterfuge would not unravel through carelessness. Charles, ever dignified, never spoke of what had transpired. But his later speeches began to carry a new tone, one that hinted at regret without naming it. In moments when he spoke of the enduring challenge between progress and preservation, those who knew the story heard the confession buried within. He had chosen unity over confrontation, peace over principle, and he had paid for it with control. His reign would go down as one of stability, yet behind that calm exterior was the faint trace of defeat, a king who had kept his throne but lost the freedom to shape it entirely. Camilla's grace endured, but not without bitterness. Her public warmth became her armor, her composure the weapon she wielded against those who had outmaneuvered her. She never confronted Anne or Beatrice, never allowed the feud to show. But the distance between them was permanent, a reminder that victory in the monarchy never leaves its victims untouched. And so, the crown stood unbroken, yet altered. The echoes of that hidden war lingered in every bow, every speech, every carefully staged photograph. The world would never know how close the royal family had come to tearing itself apart from within. The alliance that saved the monarchy had also changed it forever, rewriting not only its future, but the very nature of loyalty itself. For beneath the grandeur and ceremony, one truth endures: the monarchy is not preserved by unity, but by the quiet wars waged in its name. And so, behind the smiles and ceremonies, the war for the crown continues unseen, unspoken, but far from over.